It's the 29th, and I have since bought a ring light to help me on my YouTube journey. So, today we're going to be talking about a little bit of the cosmology of the world that I'm building, as well as where orcs come from. Now, the planet is a planet that revolves around a bluish star, and as it revolves, it has two rings that overlap each other, one around the equator and one that centers around the poles. And it has two moons, one that transverses this way and another that transverses that way. Think of it like Exandria with like Ruidus and Catha. So there's one major moon, there's one minor moon. The major moon is a swamp-like planetoid. It revolves around the central planet, and it houses all the orcs, all the trolls, all the goblins, all of those kinds of creatures, like ogres and whatnot. Now, the orcs I'm taking directly from 40k. They are directly related to the 40k orcs. Now, what ended up happening was there was an orc band that was traveling through the warp, and they wanted to go to a different place where they have never been before. They wanted to go fight something that they have never fought before. And they wanted to experience glorious, glorious battle. Well, the god of the universe of my homebrew world heard what they were asking, because he is omniscient and omnipotent and omnipresent in his own universe and extremely powerful in all the others. So he snatched them from that universe through the void, and because of the way that physics works in that world, their psionic components kind of fell apart and they weren't able to gain any kind of thrust, so their ship drifted through the void and ended up crash landing on the moon. Now, if you've ever read Hunter x Hunter, you know what chimera ants are and kind of how they reproduce. Well, there were some hog-like chimera ant-esque creatures that were there that began to eat them. And as they ate them, the planet became infected with the spores of the orcs. And as they became infected and sprouted more orcs, those hog-like creatures continued to eat the orcs. And after about a century or so of this ravenous feeding, the orcs themselves were completely eradicated. The spores were dug up and eaten. The mushroom tower stalks were completely devoured. And what was left were two kinds of orcs. You had the hog-like orcs that are known as the tan boys, and you still had the green boys, which were the green orcs with the tusks, stereotypical orcs. Now, those orcs, after several hundred more years, decided that they wanted to try to create themselves again. And none of those experiments worked because orcs in the 40k universe don't have real science. They don't have real connectivity to engineering or any kind of advanced bioengineering, but it didn't stop them from trying, because they were beginning to get a hold of the magic and the psionics that existed already deep inside them in order to try to jerry-rig these contraptions. Now, the result were ogres, trolls, goblins, and those goblins further mutated. So the trolls were very difficult to control because they were extremely ravenous and hungry, and so they were kind of cast out into the wastes because they continuously regenerated. The ogres were too dumb, and so they were also cast out into other parts of this moon, And then the magnum opus of the orcs were the goblins. Now, the goblins ended up being very populous. They were created essentially to be something of a slave race, but not really. They were created to help with menial tasks that the orcs didn't necessarily want to do. But aside from them being tasked to do those things, they're pretty much free to do whatever they want. So they ended up reproducing rapidly. Now, because the genomes were not properly established within the goblins, they mutated. The very first was a strange red mutation that occurred in goblin kind. He was taller, he was stronger, he was smarter, and his teeth were a little bit less jagged. And his name was Hob. Now, Hob was the very first of his kind to mutate in this fashion. And those that mutated after him, as well as those who were born after him, were known as Hob's goblins, which is where we get hobgoblins. The second one was his brother, whose name was Bugs. Now, Bugs was a nudist, and he did not enjoy wearing clothes. He enjoyed being sneaky and playing pranks, and he was kind of a trickster. Now, Bugs had others that mutated similar to him, and they were called Bugs Bears, because they were all nudists, and that became shortened to Bugbears shortly after. The goblins continued to grow and split off from each other into these three factions until eventually something very unstable and weird happened within them, and they ended up turning into what I'm taking from Acquisitions Incorporated of the Verden. The Verden were just another mutation of goblins that were very similar to goblins, but they were not exactly like goblins. Again, they were a little bit different colored green. They thought differently. Their psychology was differently. Their biology ended up being different. And so you ended up with 4 different kinds of goblins. You ended up with the normal goblins, you ended up with Hobbs goblins, Bugs Bears, and you ended up with the Verdan. Now, the orcs were split into the two, and so you had those 2 factions. And the trolls and the ogres ended up splitting off into their factions as well. And that was the beings that inhabited the moon. Now, there was one additional creature that was created that was the Oni. The Oni were violent and irascible, and there wasn't anything that they could do to stop them from being that way, aside from killing them, but not wanting to kill them. They again cast them out into the waste. Now, they're very few and far between, but the Oni do exist on that moon. Now, additionally, on this moon, which I have yet to name, the goblins became so populous that it began to become an actual problem. Resources started to dwindle on the moon, and this is all happening before first contact from the humans of the planet below. The gods intervened. Specifically, the water goddess Amaya Umi stepped in. Now, Amaya was friends to the goblins and liked them, was kind to them, and as a result garnered a lot of favor from the goblins. She also garnered a lot of favor from the Fae themselves, and so she was able to negotiate a treaty that was all-encompassing, that took a lot of these goblins from the material plane and put them into the Fae Wild. And that is why you end up with a distinction between the goblins of the Fae and the goblins of the material plane. And there were some goblins that decided not to go to the material plane or the Fae, and they split off and went to the shade, or the shadow. Basically, the shadow fell in my world. And those goblins, and orcs also joined them as well, ended up becoming the shadow orcs. Now, I haven't come up with any fancy name for them yet, but I'm going to extrapolate on that later. Now, the fun part is that right before the very first war that popped off that was not directly related to interplanar threats, rather intraplanar threats. They were actually affected by the incursion of the fiends that came in from a different world that exists within that universe. And as a result, a lot of them created the Orgalions, or I think that's what they're called anyway, that were mixtures of fiends, or the Tanarooks. I think they were called Tanarooks. But anyway, the mixtures between fiends and orcs. But those, upon the pact that was established by the god Ptarae, of the thing that split the fiends into different factions, I think they're called Tanarooks, were taken from the material plane and essentially made full-blown fiends, and they were put into the realms that they came from. So, that being said, the orcs ended up having first contact during the very first war that broke out on the material plane on the main planet there of the Dragon War. And they were instrumental in maintaining the front lines and keeping the dragons and the Dragonborn at bay. And I'll go more into how Dragonborn are different in my world in a different video. But the orcs ended up gaining the ability to settle on the main planet below, and as a result of a lot of the men dying as a result of this war, the surviving orcs interbred with humans, and that's how you ended up with half-orcs. And half-orcs didn't exist until the very middle of the Dragon War, which lasted an indiscriminate amount of time. I actually haven't come up with that part yet. That's the glory of building a new world with new stuff, is I don't have it all figured out yet, but I'm excited to make it. So, you have the half-orcs, which originated, and then they started to, spread across the world. And that is the origin story of how orcs and goblins and goblin-like races, as well as orc-like races, came to become in my world. So thank you so much for joining me today. This has been D and Demetrion. My name is Aaron Demetrion, and thank you for helping me build this world. So let's keep building stuff together. Have a good night.